Hi guys. I wanted to talk to you today about telling time. Human beings have always had a need for marking the passage of time. How else would we all know what time to come to school every day? How will I know what time you're supposed to have lunch or to send you home? How could you show up at your swimming lessons at the same time as your swimming teacher if we didn't all have some way of knowing what time it was to go to the pool? Adults talk about time a lot, as you know, usually in the form of, hurry up, we're late, or we have to be there in 10 minutes, or, oh, I've been standing in this line for half an hour. So we know that time is important, but telling time is complicated, isn't it? How many of us have had to work really hard to learn to tell time? I know I did. It's not like counting with the golden beads, is it? With our golden beads, it's easy. We count our units, 1, 2, 3, 4. When we get 10 units, what do? Yeah, we trade in for a bar of 10. And then we count our tens, 1 10, 2 10s, 3 10s, 4 10s. And when we get up to 10 10s, we trade in for 100. Our system is called the decimal system because it's based in the number 10. And our system, every time we get 10, we trade in. But clocks do not work on the decimal system. And that's because the clock is based in 2 different number systems. One from the ancient Egyptians, which was a base 12 system called the duodecimal system. And the other is from the Babylonians, who used a system based in the number 60 called the Sexagesimal System. So if you have had a little trouble learning to tell time on a clock, don't worry about it, because it's using 2 kind of complicated number systems, and you're in good company because it's not easy and a lot of people have had trouble with it. So let's start by talking a little bit about how it is our clocks came to be this way. It starts with the ancient Egyptians, thousands and thousands of years ago. And the ancient Egyptians were the first people to kind of look at the day and divide it up into chunks. And remember, their counting system was based in the number 12. So they divided the daylight hours into 12 parts and the nighttime hours into 12 parts. And if it was at the equinoxes, where we have equal day and equal night, then those 12 parts roughly reflected 1 hour, like they do today. But the funny thing was, back then, if they were getting closer to summer, where the days were getting longer and the nights were getting shorter, what they did is they took those 12 daylight hours and they just stretched them so that it was longer than an hour. And they took those nighttime hours and they shortened them. And then when it got to be wintertime and the days got a little shorter and the night got a little longer, they did the opposite. And this system actually caught on and was used really widely for a very long time. So the length of an hour in the day depended on what time of year it was. Sounds a little confusing to me. So as with our story of communication and signs and our story of numbers, we all know that the Egyptians had something and then the Greeks took it and changed it a little bit. We've heard that in many of our stories. And this story is no different. So the Greeks were the first to look at the 12 daylight hours and 12 nighttime hours and say, hey, let's put those together and call that 24-hour period one day, including one daytime period and one nighttime period. And they took that day and they divided it into 12 equal parts. And that's where we get our hours. Now, the Greeks were big fans of the sexagesimal system used by the Babylonians. And remember, that system had a base of 60. This is because 60 is a number that can be divided evenly by a lot of other numbers. You can easily divide it in half, or thirds, or fourths, fifths, sixths, even twelfths. So it made a lot of sense to take each hour and divide it into groups of 60, which they called minutus primae, and then again into another 60 parts. Each minute was then divided into another 60 parts called minutus secundae, seconds. And that's where we get the names, minute and second. And I bet you know who the next characters in our story are, because we had the Egyptians and the Babylonians, and then we had the Greeks who took their system and changed it a little bit. And now we have you guessed it, the Romans. Well, the Romans inherited the system of the Greeks, 12 hours of daylight followed by 12 hours of night, and they started counting their hours from sunrise, and they called that hour 1 prima. So hour 3 tertia was mid-morning, hour 6 sexta was midday, and hour 9 none was mid-afternoon. Echoes of this system still linger in our language today. We call a midday break a siesta after the sexta of the Romans. And noon, our word for 12 o'clock noon, is derived from none, which would have been more mid-afternoon for the Romans, but you know, they maybe ate lunch later then, and we like to eat our lunch a little earlier, so noon kind of got moved up a little bit. Well, then we come to the invention of clocks, because while all of the people we discussed were coming up with ways to mark the passage of time, no one had really invented a reliable device for marking time. And it took many, many years for this to happen. At first, people really marked the passage of time by watching the motion of the stars at night and the moving shadows on the ground in the daytime. And sometimes they put sticks into the ground to cast shadows, and they used those to mark time. Those were the first sundials. They also tried things like putting stripes on a candle so that as the candle burned, you could see how many stripes were still left, and that would tell you how much time had passed. They used a water clock, which was a pot with a hole in it that dripped water at a slow and steady rate into another pot. And then you could look into the pot and see how much water had dripped out and know how much time had passed. They also used sand glasses. We might call them hourglasses today. Those are those bulbs that look like almost like a number 8, and they have sand in the top, and the sand drips down into the bottom. We have those. Sometimes we have little plastic ones in our games, or we might use them to remind us how long to brush our teeth, that kind of thing. So we still use those sometimes. But there were a lot of problems with these methods. You had to replace a candle every time it was used. Or for the water clock, you had to remember to go refill the pot when it ran out of water. And with the hourglass, someone had to remember to flip it over so it could start again. So none of them were very exact, and they took a lot of work. It was not until about 700 years ago that the first mechanical clocks were made in Europe. Now, these had a system of gears and pulleys. They kept time well, and it wasn't quite as much trouble to keep going as some of the other methods. But they were not small like our clocks today. These were huge and expensive. Only big, important buildings like churches could have them. And they didn't tell the minutes, only the hours. And it didn't show the time on a clock face. Instead, it rang a bell every hour. The bells would ring out and everyone in town would know what time it was. Now, if you visit a European city today, you will definitely hear these clocks ringing their bells. And some of our cities here in the US also have them. The next type of clock to be designed used a weight that hangs from a cord. And the other end of the cord is wound around a drum. And as the weight slowly drops, the drum turns the pieces of the clock. And a weight clock also usually has something called a pendulum that helps to slow the weight from dropping too quickly. And you have probably seen a clock like this with a pendulum on the front. Sometimes we call these grandfather clocks. They have to be very large in order to have room for the weight and the pendulum. And so they're quite expensive and they take up a lot of space. And people eventually wanted to have smaller clocks. So the spring clock was invented. And instead of a weight, these clocks had a mechanical spring inside that would get wound very tightly, and then it would gradually unwind. And as it unwound, it would move the parts of the clock. Some spring clocks still did have to have a pendulum to help to balance the movement of the spring, but most spring clocks could be made much smaller than the weight clocks. But both weight clocks and spring clocks were very expensive to make, and they weren't necessarily very exact. And certainly not everyone could afford to have a clock like this in their home. And so by the late 1800s, the electric clock is invented. And this had a small motor that was powered by an electric current. This kind of clock was more accurate and very affordable, so people could afford to have them. Most of the clocks we have now run on either electricity or a battery. My clock back there is running on a battery. And they can be made so inexpensively that each of us has several clocks in our house. And usually, each person has their own watch. Some of us have several watches. So clockmaking has changed a lot in the last 700 years. So let's talk now about telling time. Remember earlier in my story when we talked about the ancient Egyptians who first divided the daytime into 12 parts. And then they divided the nighttime into 12 parts. And then the ancient Greeks came along and decided that they would put one day and one night together into one 24-hour period. And then you remember, after the sundials and the candles and the water clocks and the sunglasses, the first mechanical clock was invented. Only it didn't have a face like we're used to. It just rang a bell every hour. Well, many years later, the first weight clock or pendulum clock was invented, and these were the first clocks to have a clock face like we are used to. And it was with these clocks that the Babylonian Sexagesimal System was used to mark the passing of time. Now remember, the Babylonians loved the number 60, and the Greeks loved geometry. So it was Ptolemy, a Greek geometer, who noticed that a circle, I'm going to try to show you here. There it is. I love it when it works. Ptolemy noticed that a circle could easily be divided into 60 parts. And so I have here a circle, and if I start at the top and I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, and 60 brings me back to the top. So they took the circle and divided it into 60 equal parts, and these were the minutes. Each one of these little marks means 1 minute. And this was a great idea because 60 minutes could be divided easily into 12 equal parts. And these were the hours. Now you might wonder, why are there only 12 hours on the clock when really a full day has 24? Well, it seems that back in Europe, some countries like Italy did use a 24-hour clock, while other countries like Germany used a 12-hour clock and just went all the way around the clock 2 times every day. And the people in Germany got really interested in making clocks and made a lot of clocks, and they made some really interesting clocks too. That would be a whole other story that we could talk about. They are the inventors of the cuckoo clock. But back to the 12-hour clock. It also seems that to make a 12-hour clock required fewer pieces, and it was just simpler to build. And so for a couple of different reasons, the 12-hour clock really caught on. And we've gotten used to using a 12-hour clock, and we don't get too confused by having a 7 o'clock a.m. and a 7 o'clock p.m. So we manage. Now, the clock face has 2 hands. It has a short hand for telling us what hour we are on. And then it has a long hand for telling us how many minutes past the hour we are on. So in order to count the minutes, you have to start at the top and count, not looking at these numbers, but counting these minutes here, these minute marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So right now we are 5 minutes past 2 o'clock. Now, did you notice that when we take those 60 minutes that our clock is divided into, and we take that 60 and divide it by 12 hours, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that we get 5 minutes between each number. So from here to here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's going to be an important thing to remember. That's a key to helping you tell time. Well, now you know all of the reasons why it is so tricky to learn to tell time. It's because it uses not just 1, but 2 different number systems that are both a lot different than the decimal system we use for counting. And when you look at a clock, what you are seeing is the product of thousands and thousands of years of different civilizations building on the same system. 4,000 years ago, the system that you now use for telling time was invented. And it took almost 3,500 of those years for the system to be refined to the one we use today. Now we can tell time so precisely that we can time a swimming race down to the thousandths of a second. And we can thank the ancient Egyptians and the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Romans and countless others across thousands of years for this tool that we use every single day. So that's my story about telling time. And now I just wanted to talk a little bit about how to help with telling time, helping children learning how to tell time. when I get a new batch of first graders, we spend a lot of time that first year on telling time. And one of the most important things that we can do to make sure that they are learning how to tell time is to conceal or get rid of all of the digital clocks in the environment. So if you have digital clocks throughout your house, you can, if it's on the microwave, you can put a little piece of electrical tape over it, and make sure you have some analog clocks around. Making sure your child has a watch, an analog watch is a very good thing to do. Around the ages of, I would say, between 5 and 7, you really want to be emphasizing telling time. The other thing that I think is absolutely critical is that whenever you have an opportunity to highlight time throughout your day, you want to take that opportunity to point it out to your child. So, well, we need to be at grandma's in 30 minutes. What time will that be? Or it takes 15 minutes to get to the library. If we leave now, what time will we get there? And the other thing you can do, and this is what we do in the classroom, this is my teaching clock, I guess, that I have in the classroom. I don't really use it the same way that you might see it used in a public school. We don't have a lot of formal lessons on time telling. Really, that story is the only formal lesson that I would have. And the rest of the telling time happens throughout the day as we are recording in our journals. And that does mean that perhaps thousands of times a week, I am sitting down and I am talking through the clock with a child. But luckily, the older children in the class will do it as well, and they'll help the younger children, so I don't have to do it every time. So what I will do is, let's say it's this time, which is 1:34 p.m. I suppose, and the child is recording in their journal. So I would take the time, and this is what I would recommend you do at home, and you can just point to the clock on the wall. You can take the clock off the wall and look at it more closely if you want to, or you can use your watch. And I would say, well, first we look at the shorthand, and you'll notice, and sometimes this is tricky because it's in between 1 and 2. So I would say, well, it has passed the 1. It hasn't yet reached the 2. So the hour is 1. And we would write that down. And now we need to look at the longhand to find out the minutes. And this is where that skip counting by 5s, if you're practicing that with them separately, that's going to help them in the end. Because you can see, you could count all the minutes going around, and many clocks will have marks for all the minutes, but not always. But you'll want to point out to them, every time I go from one number to another, that's 5 minutes. So I can count 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. And then I think I have to count by the minutes after that. So it would be 31, 32, 33, 34. So let's write down 34 minutes past 1. If you practice skip counting by 5s, then very quickly they will start to remember, oh yeah, if my longhand is here, that's 10. And that's 20. They'll start to do that multiplication kind of automatically. But practice the skip counting separately from the clock, and it'll get put together. So those are my tips. I think with the wide availability of analog clocks, digital clocks, it is getting harder for children to get enough experience telling time. So if you have a student who's a kindergartner, first grader, second grader, you will want to make sure you are highlighting the time and talking about time and how many minutes does it take to get to where we're going. We will certainly be talking about it a lot at school, but it is in the application of this skill that it really becomes a part of them. And so while as much as we talk about it at school, if it gets reinforced at home, it sticks. And that is all I have for you today about time. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.